Today I will do a presentation on Plasmodium, a disease that causes malaria. Malaria has 4 different species: Falciparum, Ovale, Malaria, and Vivax. In particular, today I will be focusing on Falciparum. I chose this because we learned a little bit about it in class, and my aunt had firsthand experience with this when she contracted it going on a camping trip and is still affected by it to this day. Next, I will move on to the actual classification of Plasmodium. So, Plasmodium is under the kingdom Protista, subkingdom Protozoa, and under Protozoa, it's considered a Sporozoa, which you can see on the left-hand side where it says letter C in the image. The phylum is Apicocomplexa, family Plasmodiae, and species Falciparum. To go more into detail, protozoa and sporozoa, they are unicellular eukaryotes, non-motile spores, pre-spores undulating ridges or waves in cell membranes, and this gives them a gliding motion. The next one is Apicocomplexan, and their characteristics for that is that what makes them distinctive is their oocytes, and that it contains infective sporocytes. And for them, this usually means that they are living in invertebrates and infect vertebrates. Now we will move on to Plasmodium falciparum. So Plasmodium falciparum is a obligate intracellular parasite. This means that they must live within another cell in order to live and replicate. So on the left side of the picture, you can see a merozoite, and that is a crescent-shaped, and these are usually formed in the liver. Specialized organelles are used to penetrate and get inside the host cells, and these are the apical end and the microtubules. And the mode of transmission for Anopheles is a pregnant female mosquito, and this is done because she needs the blood to be able to feed the larvae. And this is an example of a biological vector rather than mechanical, because a biological vector is because it's the mosquito is actually carrying it within rather than transferring from the outside or by contact. Now that we discussed a few characteristics, we can move on to transmission. So for this transmission to happen, we need a infected Anopheles mosquito. And for transmission to happen, a sporocyte from the salivary glands will be inserted into the skin and into the bloodstream. And from there, it travels to the liver via the blood. And once this happens, it takes up into the liver cells called hepatocytes. And this is when merozoites start to form asexually. After many of these merozoites form, it will form something called shunts. And once many of these are made, they are actually released by the hepatocytes into the bloodstream. And this occurs because there's so many, it actually ruptures the cell. Then once this happens, the merozoites will begin to invade the erythrocytes now, which are the red blood cells. This will form a ring-like structure that we call trophozoites. And then a lot of merozoites form once again asexually, and then form shunts, and then eventually bursting and going into a continuous cycle. This cycle will continue to repeat on, and this is dangerous because it can actually lead to death because of either depletion of red blood cells or high temperature, or there could be many other factors. But after these many cycles of merozoites being produced, they can actually turn into sexual reproduction of gametocytes. And this is where they produce both male and female. So now that there is a male and female gametocyte formed, and they're both in the red blood cells, and they remain in the body. And in order to continue that cycle of infection, there is a requirement of a unaffected Anopheles mosquito. So in order to allow it to become a sporozoite, it needs that mosquito. So then this cycle once begins when a female Anopheles unaffected mosquito go ahead and drinks the blood of the affected human. So once received inside the mosquito, the male and female parts fuse together to make the gametes, and from there form the zygote and then form oocytes. Then from there, the sporozoids begin to develop and multiply, causing the oocytes to actually rupture. And once these rupture, the sporozoites move into the salivary gland of the mosquito, where the cycle can continue and more people can get infected. And now we'll take a look at how this actually looks like. So here we'll be seeing actually the cells rupturing. And just imagine just reoccurring, and not really healthy for the body, of course. Next, we'll be moving on to the symptoms. So some symptoms are febrile illnesses, headache, discomfort, weakness, and gastrointestinal, which include nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Neurological complaints, which involve dizziness, confusion, and disorientation, and also coma. Back pain, myalgia, which is muscle pain, chills, and cough. And now that we know the symptoms, let's talk about diagnosis, treatment, and maybe possible preventions. So for diagnosis, the first thing they usually do is a blood smear. There's a thick and there's a thin. The thick is usually used for large quantities of blood samples, but in particular is sometimes hard to read. Thin is used more for identifying and counting infected cells. And they also use antigen detection test, which is a simple strip test. And they also have a parasitic nucleic acid detection. And they use the polymerase chain reaction. And this, in fact, is more sensitive and more specific than than using a microscope. But the only trouble with this is that the results aren't quick enough for routine diagnosis, so this can actually be used a lot. But PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, is useful for identifying mutations and drug resistance as well. So we'll move on to the treatments. For treatment, there are antimalarials, and the most common for fighting Plasmodium falciparum is chloroquine, but there are many resistant strains of this particular malaria that the malaria is particularly building up to. This is possibly because of the widespread of the disease and the fact that they're using this maybe more than they should because of lack of prevention. Depending on how severe, there could be oral methods, or if it's a really severe case of malaria, there could be intravenous antimalarial therapy, which would require maybe several rounds of antimalarial medication. And usually for these treatments, once you go through them, it's very common to get a negative smear to make sure that you are fully clear of malaria. So for prevention, insecticides, treated nets are really well for helping keeping out unwanted mosquitoes while you're sleeping or anywhere with openings. Insecticide is also useful in keeping the population of the Anopheles mosquitoes lower, but once again, there could be resistance to overuse of insecticide. Unfortunately, there is no vaccination right now for malaria, or in particular falciparum, or I believe any malaria. But vaccination development would help in decreasing the deaths of malaria. Also, basic use of mosquito repellent could also be very useful in preventing the large amount of deaths that occur every year. So now let's move on to who's at risk. So as of 2019, there were over 229 million cases worldwide of malaria. Of these cases, the African region had 94% of malaria cases and deaths. Some of these cases, Nigeria had 23%, Democratic Republic of the Congo had 11%, United Republic of Tanzania had 11%, and then the last three had 4%. This made up half of all malaria deaths, which is quite a bit. And what is even more surprising is that children under 5 made up 67% of deaths affected by malaria. So the most individuals who are at risk were children under 5, because they're still developing their immune systems in these ages. Pregnant women, because they're sharing the umbilical cord and sharing blood with their kids, and patients with AIDS and HIV, non-immune immigrants, mobile populations moving from places to places. That really influences the spread of this disease. And what also influences is areas that, or influences the likelihood of this Plasmodium falciparum, is areas that are warm, tropical, that have shallow waters, and which is perfect for places that are tropical because that's the climate there. So this means increased likelihood of mosquitoes living, and if it's not controllable, then it's more likely that people will get this disease, especially if it's in a region that is a third world country and maybe not have access to preventable methods. Next, we'll be talking about connections that we've made throughout the semester to what I chose, Plasmodium. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is drug resistance. So throughout our semester, we've come in to talk about drug resistance and how overuse, misuse, having it in our antibiotics, how they have come to affect our use and our need to discover new ones because of our overuse or misuse, or just growing out of that antibiotic. So things like anti-malarials, fighting malaria, is the same concept, except now that we need to find new drugs in order to help. The next thing I will be talking about is our discussion about obligate intracellular parasites, in which we discussed in one of our lectures. And in our lectures, we discussed how obligate meaning that it's a requirement, and intracellular meaning that it must be inside a cell. So obligate intracellular means that this particular pathogen microbe must live inside the cell in order to live, replicate, and continue on with its life. The next connection I made was parasitism, and this is an example of a symbiotic relationship. In this relationship, however, for parasitism, is that it only benefits the parasite and not the host. The host actually is damaged or killed by this parasite. And then the last connection I made was mechanical versus biological vectors. So in this particular one, the mode of transmission was the Anopheles mosquito, and the mosquito was an example of a biological vector, which, as I discussed, is something that is usually carried with inside something rather than outside of something. So it's not more of a like penetrative transmission rather than just contact or rubbing off, like a fly landing on maybe poop and transferring E. coli onto someone's food, which would be an example of a mechanical vector. So finally, I will move on to my thought questions. So for my thought questions, I would like to ask you, why did you think that P. falciparum is seemingly concentrated in Africa? What factors contribute to this higher concentration of cases? And second, how might the information of P. falciparum or any disease be useful to stop widespread infection? And then here are my resources, and I'd like to show this to the professor. Thank you for teaching this class. I really appreciate it.